Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at Tread Athletics, and today we're going to be breaking down the top 9 velocity training misconceptions. So the first one we're going to talk about, and number 9 on this list, is that velocity gains in a certain drill or with a certain ball weight will always transfer 1-to-1 to the mound. So if you gain 5 miles an hour on a pull down, you're going to also project 5 miles an hour of velocity gain once you go into the game. If you gain 5 miles an hour with a great plyo ball off the mound, you're going to gain 5 miles an hour in the game, right? Anyone who's actually been through several different velocity building phases understands that it's not a 1-to-1 transfer, and it completely depends on the context of what we're talking about, what ball weight we're talking about, what velocity drill we're talking about. So the best that we can do is use different drills as kind of a proxy for what we're trying to build off the mound, knowing that there's not going to be a 1-to-1 correlation to exactly how much velocity you're going to be able to actually express on the mound. One factor here is that a lot of the different drills that you're going to be doing, it's a novel stimulus. So a lot of the athletes that we work with, let's say we give them pull down or shuffles or 10 toes velocity testing or plyo velocity testing. A lot of this stuff is something they've never done before. Their systems have not adapted to it before. And so it's not uncommon to see someone come in and the first time they do a pull down, it's 87 miles an hour. And a month later, it's 97 miles an hour. So a big piece of that is they've just learned to coordinate that specific movement a little bit better because it's such a novel stimulus, or they've never thrown an underweight baseball before, and so they're throwing it with way too much tension. They're throwing it like a 5-ounce baseball. As soon as they learn to relax the arm, to float the arm, to be a little bit quicker, that ball's gonna shoot up significantly faster because it's such a new stimulus and they're not used to it. So you're gonna have to be able to piece apart the novel stimulus and the adaptation from that versus what is actually going to transfer. And so ideally, if we gain a few miles an hour in a pull down, like if we can transfer any velo at all, that's going to be a big win. And so looking at it as progress versus thinking it's going to be a certain set proportional ratio of progress. If we're progressing our different drills or different ball weights, we can kind of assume that we're moving in the right direction, continue to focus on every other piece of our velocity progression, from our mechanics to our lifting to everything else. And from there, you just kind of uncover and see, once you do ultimately get in games, how much of that did transfer. Number 8 on this list is that progress will always be quick and or linear. And so again, this is really only a misconception for those who are relatively young, relatively new to training, to velocity type programs. And so they'll come in, and a lot of times they'll have a friend or buddy, someone who's done some sort of weighted ball program or pull downs or any sort of velocity type training, who has gained, let's say 10 miles an hour on a pull down fairly quickly, or has gained a few miles an hour off the mound fairly quickly. A lot of these places out there are selling these quick transformations, these 1 day or 2 week or 1 week transformations. So they expect that same thing. And so the biggest issue and the biggest misconception is that when we have guys come in and they have unrealistic expectations about what is actually achievable in a given time frame. And it's not to say that their goals aren't achievable, it's just that in general, it's not necessarily going to happen as fast as you might expect. Now it can, and sometimes it does, if there's a really low hanging fruit mechanically, or from a strength standpoint, like it can happen very, very quickly. But we try to be upfront and honest with guys about the time frame under which a lot of these changes can actually take place. For some guys, it can take years. For some guys, it can take one session to unlock a couple miles an hour. So it completely depends on a number of factors. And then as far as thinking that progress will be linear, we see this in-house a lot when an athlete comes in-house, they get in the environment, ton of energy. And so they'll have a couple weeks straight where they're gaining velocity. They're hitting personal records on everything, a couple weeks straight, 2, 3, 4 weeks in a row. And my advice to them is always like, let's understand that progress is ultimately going to plateau at some point. If we could all just continually gain a mile an hour a week for infinity, like a year from now, we'd all be the hardest thrower in the world. So it doesn't quite work like that. And so I try to mentally prepare guys for the fact that these plateaus are going to happen. If you have back-to-back weeks of personal records, you're almost certainly going to have a down week the third week. And that's really a time to lock in the gains that you've made, try to recover your body, and just understand it's not going to be this linear progress. It's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, long plateaus where you have to kind of problem solve with your coach, figure out exactly what the new limiting factor is, address that limiting factor, and take a step forward. And so that's the honest truth about how the velocity training process works. It's not, unfortunately, as straight of a line as we'd like it to be. Number 7 on this list is that velocity type training, and specifically looking at the velocity throwing progressions, increases arm strength. Now, I understand that most people, when they say arm strength, they really are just talking about velocity, and they're using those terms interchangeably, but it's important to note that arm strength and velocity are really not the same things. When we're talking about arm strength, right, we need to be specific. What do we mean? Are we talking about bicep strength, or elbow flexion, concentric elbow flexion strength, how much weight you can curl? Are we talking about internal rotation strength? Well, we can measure that. Are we talking about external rotation isometric strength? Are we talking about how much weight we can bench press or dumbbell bench press? We need to be specific, and just using this blanket term of arm strength isn't really specific, and it isn't really true to what velocity type training or high intensity throwing is actually improving. While there could be some general correlations, right? If we're trying to aggressively improve arm strength, that's going to be a very different prescription as measured by, let's say, internal rotation, isometric strength, right? The program that attacks that is going to be much more isometrics. It's going to be much more, heavy band work, things like that. Whereas throwing, if anything, over time, if left unaddressed, you're actually going to develop some potential inhibitions and weaknesses in your throwing shoulder, and those are things that need to be attacked in the weight room and your arm care routine and your general arm conditioning work. What is actually going on with a lot of the velocity type work that we're doing? One is that there's an improvement in patterning. So as you start exposing yourself to higher intensity, again, gradual and progressive and smart higher intensities and smart workloads, we start to begin to adapt more efficient patterns, and hopefully in conjunction with a coach or in conjunction with a proper focus to what you're doing, your patterns start to improve. And so a big piece, which we'll talk about more later, where these velocity gains come from is actually the pattern itself improving, the efficiency of how you transfer energy from the ground through the hips to the trunk and ultimately out into the arm. If we can improve the efficiency of that, that's where a lot of the gains come from. And then another piece where a lot of these gains come from is just the comfort and the ability of your body to trust higher levels of intensity. So someone who's never been through a velocity throwing program before, maybe they're used to throwing, they think they're throwing max effort in the game, but really it's like 90%. 92%. They've never really had that kind of foaming at the mouth intensity, that Max Scherzer angry fastball intensity where they truly let everything they have go into the ball. And so that type of training can kind of just uncover that higher level of intensity that maybe a lot of younger guys or guys who don't have experience in this way, or even older guys who used to throw harder and they've kind of lost velocity over time, they can help them start to remember what that true max effort intensity feels like and kind of raise the floor of that intensity when they actually go into a game. The sixth misconception is that anyone and everyone is ready to do a velo program just because they want to, just because it looks cool, and they think that they're just ready to dive in right now because they saw some free program out there. Again, we've put out a program which you guys can check out, but the whole basis of this is that everyone is not ready to just jump into a weighted ball routine or a velocity training routine or anything like that, high intensity throwing for that matter, without kind of first vetting a couple basic prerequisites. Now, the Arm Care app team actually put together a whole list of prerequisites, which I will link below. I highly recommend you guys check that out. Generally, when we start to assess who's actually ready to be doing a velocity training program, we need to look at what is the actual condition that their arm is in. So have they been throwing for an entire season and they have 100 innings on their arm, and maybe they're a college pitcher? Do we need to deload them? Is it someone who's already been shut down for the entire summer and now they're coming to us in the fall and they need to go through a full on-ramp first? Do they have any major asymmetries, major mobility restrictions where they can't even get their arms overhead and their scaps aren't moving right? Maybe for that guy, we need to take a little bit of a pause, work through some mobility issues, build some strength, build some stability. So case in point, driving intensity isn't always the answer, and not everybody is ready for that. We typically like to see a very minimal strength base first, right? Guys should be able to hammer out a set of 10 to 20 push-ups. Guys should be able to hit a few chin-ups. Guys shouldn't be 50 pounds, 60 pounds, 100 pounds overweight. Right? There's some just basic things that we look for that you want to make sure they're going to be able to actually handle the stresses and handle the loads that we're going to be putting through those tissues. And so we want to set up our athletes to succeed and not just throw intensity at them in a non-responsible way, but make sure that they have some basic strength prerequisites and they've actually gone through an intelligent on-ramp before we actually give them that intensity. Now with that, not everybody needs to be doing the same level of workload or the same kind of level of conservative versus aggressive approach in their actual routine. So if we're taking a more aggressive approach, maybe it's 2 to 3 times on the mound a week, with a couple of those being high effort days, one of those being a moderate effort day, and higher workloads once they've actually built up to that. A more conservative approach might be just 1 high effort day per week, with 15 of those throws being absolute max effort. And so there's definitely a spectrum, and we're going to be individualizing how conservative or how aggressive that routine is after someone's actually passed some basic prerequisites from a strength and stability standpoint and a mobility standpoint, on-ramp properly. Then we decide kind of what track to place them along. Number 5 is that the specific part of this velocity program that's the most important is the throwing phase. Now, everyone wants to know what the next weighted ball program or throwing program or long toss program that they should be doing to increase velocity quickly is. But the fact of the matter is that's not always the most important piece, and that's not always where a lot of this velocity gain comes from. Especially with the athletes that we specifically work with one-on-one. What you kind of ultimately see when you look at it from a bird's eye view is that each athlete is going to have their own set of limiting factors. And so sometimes the limiting factor is intensity. And so just putting the gas pedal to the floor, driving intensity, that is a way to uncover quick gains for a lot of them, provided you're doing that in an intelligent way. But a lot of times it's taking a step back and looking at the big picture and saying, okay, we need to gain 20, 30 pounds. We need to add 50% to a lot of your strength metrics. We need to address your nutrition, get you in a caloric surplus, consistently gain a pound a week of weight gain to support that strength gain. We need to add another pitch. We need to change the actual grip and kind of seam orientation and figure out how to improve the efficiency of your fastball. And so you're not cutting the ball so that we can gain 2 or 3 miles an hour that way, just by improving the fastball efficiency. So when we can take a step back and look at it from a big picture, you realize that the actual throwing prescription is not always the only piece of the puzzle. There's a lot more factors going on. And if we can do that, we can look at it from that kind of pie perspective. We can start to say, okay, maybe we do have a few miles an hour that we can potentially steal from the throwing program side, the intensity side. But maybe we have a couple we can steal from the nutrition, the weight gain side. Maybe we have 1 or 2 we can steal from here, from there, from there. And so all those different things added together is how you actually construct a comprehensive, well-rounded program. So that's kind of how we approach it. Definitely don't think that all you need is just the throwing prescription and that's where all the velocity comes from. The fourth misconception is that you can indefinitely increase throwing workload and intensity without having to cut back at all on anywhere else in your program, especially your lifting. The first time a guy kind of goes through a velocity type throwing routine, what they start to say is, okay, I'm ramping up, I'm seeing velocity increases, and there's usually a critical threshold where it starts to just catch up to them. The workload catches up to them, the fatigue catches up to them, and all that throwing on top of all the heavy lifting that they're doing, it starts to be too much for their overall central nervous system and their overall tissues and connective tissues and muscles actually recover from. And so there's going to be a breaking point somewhere along the lines if we don't incorporate deloads or we don't incorporate a little bit lower volume in what they're doing kind of outside of their throwing. So it ultimately becomes a balancing act. The more throwing intensity and workload that we take on, the lower recovery resources that we have available from an actual training standpoint. And so we need to be able to, again, take a step back, look at the totality of what's going on, and say, as the throwing intensity and workload goes up, as we start to not be able to recover nearly as much from that increased workload, we need to either start to incorporate deloads or we need to start to lower the volume or the intensity of what's actually going on in the weight room. And so that's a balancing act that we strike with our guys and just recognize going into it. Like, if you're going to go 3 straight months of pull downs, I'm not saying I would recommend that, but you certainly are not going to be able to do some German volume training and heavy eccentric training, upper body and lower body, in 6 days a week. You're not going to be able to just do everything all the time, max volume, max intensity, throwing and lifting. Something's got to give. And unfortunately, a lot of guys learn that lesson after an injury versus proactively before the injury happens. Number 3 kind of builds off the last point, which is that more is better. Now, again, more is better to a point. If we only did high intensity throwing maybe once per month, right, that's probably not enough frequency and enough volume to get some of the adaptations that we're looking for. On the flip side, if we try to throw high intensity 3 times a week or 4 times a week, or I know guys that throw 5 times a week, max effort, and do pull downs, right, there's a point at which most athletes are not going to be able to recover from that level of workload. I understand this idea of adapt or die, and I understand the point that people are trying to make with this. It's like, you need to stress your body, progressive overload, to get your body to adapt. The problem is there is a limit and a capacity to how much you can adapt and what workload you can actually get to. Right? There's a point at which you're not going to be able to throw 300 pitches in a start and recover and do that 5 days later and do that for 10 straight years. If that were the case, we would be seeing that a little bit more. Now, in the past, maybe in the 1970s, 80s, right, pitchers could throw and cruise at sub-maximal efforts, and so they could maybe throw 150 pitches. They could throw 9 innings every single time. Now, with guys throwing circa max effort, mid-90s, upper 90s, there's just a limit to what you're actually going to be able to tolerate. So I'm not saying we shouldn't start to kind of slowly push that boundary, slowly push that threshold, and find out where it is. But the point is that there is an upper limit, and we need to be intelligent about where that is. And kind of going on with a future point, which I'll talk about here in a second, is the intensity and the workload is not where the bulk of the velocity gains are actually going to come from. So knowing that, we can sometimes be a little bit more conservative, especially with certain athletes, especially at certain times of the year where we know when to push and we know when to back off a little bit. So just recognize more is not always better. The second biggest misconception that people have about velocity training programs is that weighted balls are a necessary piece of velocity training. Now, I could change this one to say that long toss is a necessary piece of velocity training, or that gaining weight is a necessary piece of velocity training, or that bench press is a necessary piece, or that pull downs are a necessary piece of velocity training, or that anything that we traditionally associate with velocity type training has to be there, has to be a piece. I can definitely assure you that having worked with thousands of athletes as a company and seen the vast majority of them gain velocity, that while there are similarities, there are very, very, very few absolutes. And so there's plenty of guys that we worked with that have not touched a weighted ball outside of just a 5-ounce baseball. So what you kind of begin to realize and understand is that it's the nature of improving someone's patterns, which is the big piece of it. And it's the nature of just gradually increasing throwing intensity, throwing workload, even if that is just with a 5-ounce ball. Even if that's just at 60 feet, or at 120 feet on a line, or at 300 feet on an arc, or at 350 feet on an arc, or with a 7-ounce ball, and a 5-ounce ball, and a 6-ounce ball, and a 4-ounce ball, or just with a 5-ounce ball. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but the commonalities are gradually increasing our tolerance to higher intensities, having some sort of high intensity stuff and building up to that throughout the off season, and obviously in season, building that out, improving strength metrics to some of our basic kind of core thresholds, and making sure that we have some sort of intelligent way of managing overall workload and having a progression to everything that we're doing. So it's by no means an absolute that you have to throw weighted balls to gain velocity, and certainly a lot of our guys don't do that. And so we'll often use kind of slightly heavier balls than a baseball to kind of improve the patterning side of things, and we'll use kind of slightly lighter balls than a baseball to improve the arm speed side of things. This can go down a whole nother rabbit hole about the type of athlete we're dealing with, if it's more of a reactive or kind of a muscle-based athlete, or more of a fast twitch or more of a slow twitch athlete, however you want to classify them. For the guys who have a little bit better arm speed, we might kind of bias them a little bit more towards the heavier balls. And for the guys who have maybe a little bit less arm speed, a little bit more on the arm strength side, but they're a little bit slower movers, we might bias them more towards the underweight stuff to kind of work on that side of the spectrum. Just like with a sprinter, you might do kind of overspeed sprints for certain types of athletes and underspeed sprints for others. That being said, it's certainly not an absolute, and we've had plenty of situations where we just use 5-ounce balls. Guys aren't comfortable with weighted balls for whatever reason, that's okay, we're still able to get results with them. So again, weighted balls are not necessarily mandatory. There's certain use cases for each type, and that's the second biggest misconception. So here we are, the #1 top velocity training misconception. Now I've alluded to this a little bit already in this video, but the top misconception is that you have to throw at max effort to gain velocity. Now, while there are certainly benefits to throwing max effort and it should not be completely avoided in a velocity training program, we've also had athletes that go through 4, 6, 8 weeks where they gain velocity and they're not throwing hard at all. So we've had athletes that came to us with UCL sprains and we shut them down for 12 weeks. And when they came back and finally on-ramped, they gained 6-7 miles an hour. Why? Because they put on 20 pounds, their strength metrics shot through the roof, and we addressed their mechanical deficiencies. And so when they did finally on-ramp from that initial injury, they'd gained 6 or 7 miles an hour as a result, despite not having thrown max effort the entire time. The way that we look at it is patterning first. If we can find a way to improve their actual mechanical efficiency, that's not only going to improve the actual sustainability of that velocity, but it's going to come without this excess risk of these overly aggressive weighted ball or velocity type training programs. So I've seen some extremely aggressive velocity training programs where it's, every other day or 3 days a week of running pull downs with everything from 2-ounce to 2-pound balls, and it's 5 throws of each ball, so it's like 30 max effort throws 3 times a week. It's insane volumes at max intensity where guys are just always in this chronically sore and just pushing up to that level where you're risking injury almost every single week because that volume, that workload is so high. What we try to do is we err a little bit more on the side of caution with some of that stuff because we've seen just how powerful this other side of the equation is, where if you can improve the patterning, the efficiency, you can address the velocity equation from the weight room, so from the strength, from the power training in the weight room, from the mobility and corrective side of the equation, then you don't actually need ridiculous volumes from a throwing standpoint to get some of those adaptations. We've also seen just great results with a lot of our pro guys specifically, 1 day a week of max effort throwing and 1 day, where it's kind of a moderate to higher effort day, but it's not true max effort. So we've seen excellent results with that because that's a little bit more of a sustainable volume. If you're balls to the wall 2 or 3 days a week, and you just do that consistently, you're gonna hit a wall at some point. You are gonna be gradually accumulating fatigue. And whether that's 6 weeks later, or 8 weeks later, or 12 weeks later, you're eventually gonna run into a wall unless you consistently have deloads in place. For me, I prefer to, with a lot of guys, again, it depends on the scenario, you go 1 max effort day and 1 hybrid, 80%, 85% bullpen or pull down or whatever it ends up being for the actual kind of footwork or throwing type, it ends up being a lot more consistent. You're able to run that type of volume for a lot longer without necessarily having to deload constantly. Again, more is not better. We've touched on that. Progress is not linear. We've touched on that. Weighted balls are not mandatory. We've touched on that. But throwing max effort constantly is not necessary either to gain velocity. And again, if you take a step back and you really understand what your specific limiting factors are, if you address that limiting factor, then by definition, you will reach a new tier of velocity. So if your limiting factor is limited strength, you don't even hypothetically have to be throwing at all to come back and be throwing harder in the future by addressing that limiting factor, by addressing that strength. Look at it from that perspective and that standpoint. It starts to kind of open up a new lens of looking at velocity training and realizing like this is just one piece of the puzzle. So you guys probably made it to the end of this video and you're wondering, well, where do I go from here? I would definitely encourage you guys to check out our free 4-week intro to weighted ball training program, which you can check out in the link down below. Essentially, we take you through the entire thought process of how we construct a throwing program, how we construct a pre and post throwing routine for our guys, give you some different sample drills and sample prescriptions for all of that. So it's not a set routine, it's actually explaining to you how to build your own individualized routine. So go ahead, check that out. And if you have any questions about that or anything else, you can either drop a comment down below or you can shoot us an email to contact@treadathletics.com. And then finally, if you guys have ideas for future content videos, we're always looking for more ideas, always looking to answer your guys' questions. So again, you can drop a comment, email us, you can follow me on Twitter and just shoot a message directly to me. Any of those will work. But appreciate you guys watching and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks again.